I invite you to listen to a dramatic, original story about betrayal and retribution, however difficult it may be, on my Purple Heart Stories channel. And please show your support with a like and subscribe if you enjoy it. Chapter 1: The Return. My name is Jack Stone. I'm 42, and I've buried love twice. The first time was when cancer took my Mary, leaving me a single father with 7-year-old Tommy. The second was about to happen in my hometown, where I returned after 15 years. The road to Pine Ridge seemed endless as my son and I drove to bury my father, the owner of the largest sawmill in the county and a man who considered me a traitor for choosing the army over the family business. I couldn't imagine that my father's funeral would be just the beginning of a nightmare, that my brother would meet me as a rival, not a blood relative, that my new wife, Catherine, whom I married just 6 months ago, is hiding a secret capable of destroying everything I hold dear, and that in this small town, where everyone knows your name, the closest people will turn out to be the most dangerous enemies. Only, I didn't know then that not only the inheritance was at stake, but the life of the only person for whom I would kill anyone without hesitation, my son. 15 years, it felt like a lifetime had passed. The old Ford devoured the last miles to Pine Ridge, and I, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, kept glancing at my grandfather's watch, an old Timex with a worn strap. A silly habit developed in the war, always knowing the exact time, even when you're in deep trouble under enemy fire. "Dad, are you okay?" Tommy's voice pulled me out of my trance. I glanced at my son, thin, pale, with sad eyes too serious for a 12-year-old boy. Jeans, old sneakers, and a blue shirt that Catherine bought for him last Christmas. He was sitting, hugging his knees as if trying to become smaller. "Everything's fine, buddy," I lied. "It's just been a while since I've been around these parts." The pines on both sides of the road closed over us in a green tunnel, absorbing the light of the late August sun. They were still the same, tall, mighty, with a heavy smell of resin that always gave me a headache. These forests had fed our family for generations. Or devoured. The closer we got to Pine Ridge, the more it seemed to me that the pines were leaning over the road, like jailers checking if their prisoner had escaped. On the back seat, a black suit swayed in a garment bag. The last time I wore it was at the funeral of Mary, Tommy's first wife and mother. 5 years ago, she was consumed by cancer in just 9 months, leaving me with a 7-year-old son and a hole in my chest the size of the Grand Canyon. But at least cancer is honest. It doesn't pretend, unlike people. "Look, a sign," Tommy pointed to a leaning sign. "Welcome to Pine Ridge. Population 4,327. I turned off the radio, where Neil Young was droning something about a rusty moon. "When I left here, there were almost 5,000 of us," I said. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who wanted to get away. Tommy was silent, studying the new world outside the window, the main street with cracked asphalt, the old movie theater turned into a Pentecostal church, the peeling, always low prices sign above the supermarket. It was clear there was nowhere for them to grow in this dump. "And there's not even a McDonald's," he finally asked with the sincere disappointment that only children are capable of. "No, buddy, but there's Millie's Diner, which makes the best strawberry milkshakes on the entire coast." I turned into the familiar parking lot in front of a squat brick building. I needed to get some coffee and collect my thoughts before heading to the stone house. Besides, Catherine was supposed to arrive before us anyway to prepare the house, as she put it. Catherine. I met her 2 years ago at a charity event for veterans, an attractive, smart, energetic woman with red hair and a snow-white smile. She worked at an insurance company and gave the impression of someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life. My brother Michael arranged the meeting through mutual acquaintances. "She'll get you both back on your feet," he said then. Irony. Bloody irony. Millie's Diner hadn't changed a bit in 15 years. The same faded photos on the walls, the same smell of fried bacon and coffee, Even the cracked leatherette on the booth seemed to be in the same places. I ordered Tommy a milkshake, myself a black coffee. Good heavens, if it isn't Jack Stone himself gracing us with his presence. A voice from the past hit me like a punch to the gut. Ray Dawson, my best high school friend, now heavier, balding, and in greasy overalls, but with the same crooked grin on his lips. Time spares no one, and in towns like Pine Ridge, it flows like tar slowly, a ND Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, burying alive those who couldn't escape. Ray, I stood up and we hugged awkwardly in a manly way. Long time no see. Yeah, it's been forever. He sat down at our table, nodding to Tommy. And this must be your son. Looks just like his mother, doesn't he? Yes, this is Tommy. I put my hand on my son's shoulder. Tommy, this is Mr. Dawson. We went to school together. Just Ray, kid, Dawson chuckled. Mister is my old man, rest his soul. Tommy nodded politely, fidgeting with the straw in his milkshake. So you're back to bury the old man. Ray got down to business. My condolences, brother. Walter was quite the mean person, but no one deserved an end like that. I frowned. What are you talking about? Ray hesitated. So you don't know, shoot. Well, the doctors said it was lung cancer, but never mind. It's probably just rumors. He hastily changed the subject, told me he was working as a mechanic in his father's garage. Married to Susie Parker, they had 2 girls. All as it should be, no surprises. Then the conversation eventually returned to family matters. Your sawmill, they say, isn't in the best shape, Ray lowered his voice, although the neighboring tables were empty. Michael, well, he cuts corners. Old Peterson was saying that the safety standards there are a real mess. 3 workers lost their hands last year. And there are also rumors about some shady orders. Not that I'm sticking my nose into it, of course. I nodded, feeling a spiral of anxiety twisting inside. Michael had always been ambitious, but not to the point of risking people. At least, that's what I thought. Thanks for the information, Ray. I'll look into it. Dawson clearly wanted to say something else, but hesitated. Anything else? I prompted him. Well, it's nothing really, he waved his hand dismissively. Just your new wife, Catherine, right? Nice piece of work. She was floating around here before, you know, long before your wedding. I tried to maintain a neutral expression, although something cold spread under my ribs. Really, I didn't know she had connections in Pine Ridge. Well, you know what they say, it's a small world. Ray smiled stiffly, glancing at his watch. All right, I gotta go. Banks is clearly chomping at the bit for me to finish with his jalopy. Glad to see you, Jack, and good luck. You're gonna need it. He left, leaving me with a bunch of questions and a cup of cold coffee. Mr. Dawson is strange, Tommy whispered. Yeah, buddy, I agreed, looking out the window at the main street, where Ray was hurrying around puddles from yesterday's rain. Everyone's a little strange in this town. The stone house stood on a hill, towering over the town, like a reminder of the family's power. A 3-story mansion made of logs darkened with time, built by my great-grandfather, looked at us with black windows, like an old man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. I turned off the engine and looked at Tommy. Well, here we are. It's very spacious, he said, clutching a tattered paperback, his constant companion since Mary died. Spacious, I agreed, smiling at his word choice. And the basement is even bigger, you can get lost in there. And ghosts. You're lying, Tommy smiled slightly. Okay, I was exaggerating about the ghosts. When we got out of the car, Catherine was already standing on the wide porch, as if she had been waiting for us all this time. She looked stunning, perfectly styled red hair, skinny jeans, a white blouse, as if she had stepped out of a country living magazine. Behind her, the half-open door gaped, leaking semi-darkness. Jack, Tommy, finally. She ran off the porch and hugged me tightly, enveloping me in the scent of jasmine perfume. Then she bent down to Tommy. And you, young man, have grown since we last met. Come on, show me your biceps." My son smiled awkwardly but didn't raise his arms. Catherine loved to play the perfect stepmother when I was around, but there was never any real connection between them. Although, to be honest, who did Tommy connect with after his mother's death? Even with me, he was often as if behind a glass wall I could see him, but I couldn't really reach him. The house greeted us with the smell of pine resin and stale dust. Inside, it was cool and gloomy, high ceilings, walls paneled with dark wood, heavy, solid furniture that seemed to have grown into the floor over the decades. Everything looked practically the same as on the day of my escape into the army. "Maybe we'll give Tommy a room on the second floor," Catherine suggested, "the one that overlooks the forest." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "That was my room when I was a kid." "Was it?" She smiled serenely. "Just a guess." We went up the creaky stairs, and she confidently led us down the hallway, unerringly finding her way through the maze of identical doors. "This is the one," Catherine said, opening the third door on the right. Inside, it was clean but somehow lifeless. A bed, a dresser, a desk. And I couldn't believe my eyes. An old Metallica poster still hung on the wall, yellowed but intact. I had taped it up myself when I was 14, and my father yelled that I was ruining the expensive pine panels. "How do you know this house?" I asked Catherine when Tommy moved to the window. "You know your way around here better than I do." "You sent me pictures, honey," she brushed it off. "Besides, I arrived a few hours earlier, had time to look around." I nodded, but an inner voice kept insisting that something was wrong. The fact that Catherine knew which door led to my former room seemed strange to me, but maybe it was just paranoia, amplified by returning to the place I was so eager to escape. "I'll go get our stuff out of the car," I said. "I'll help," Catherine volunteered. As we walked into the hallway, I looked back. Tommy was standing at the window, pressing his hand to the glass, looking at the pines that were approaching the house, like a patient army. The funeral was scheduled for the next day. The small St. Patrick's Church was packed to the rafters. My father had weight in the community, and locals don't miss such events. It's like a play, only free, and in a town with one movie theater turned into a church, there's not much entertainment. I stood in the front row in that same black suit. To my right, Tommy, pale and tense, in a suit we bought hastily at Saks Fifth Avenue before leaving. To my left, Catherine, impeccable in a black dress just below the knees, with a suitably mournful expression on her face. The coffin stood before the altar, closed. They didn't let me see my father's body, citing his last will, and that seemed strange too. Walter Stone was never sentimental. The priest spoke of the legacy left behind, of the unyielding will, and loyalty to the family business. Every word pierced me like a splinter. 15 years ago, when I announced my decision to join the army instead of taking over the sawmill, my father called me a coward and a traitor. "You're no longer in this family," he said then. I felt someone looking at me and turned my head. In the third row sat Michael, my older brother, whom I hadn't seen since our mother's funeral 10 years ago. He had changed a lot, dark circles under his eyes, and his once dark hair was touched with gray, like mine. A worried wrinkle lay between his eyebrows, and it seemed like it had been there for many years. Our eyes met, and Michael nodded almost imperceptibly. I returned the gesture, feeling a strange tension building inside. We grew up in the same house, shared secrets and childhood dreams, but our father's parenting style, through constant rivalry and comparison, had destroyed our connection even before I left Pine Ridge. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that Sheriff Bobby Stone, our cousin, was standing at the very back of the church, avoiding looking in my direction. We used to be inseparable. This distance also seemed unnatural. After the service, we all moved to the cemetery, where my great-grandfather, grandfather, and now father were buried in the shade of mighty oaks. The day was overcast, as if even the sky had decided to honor the memory of Walter Stone. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, I noticed Tommy whisper something to Catherine, and she, thinking I wasn't looking, squeezed his wrist tightly, painfully. The boy flinched but said nothing. The funeral ritual meaningless and unchanging. The priest said something, everyone threw a handful of earth, the women cried quietly, the men nodded with serious faces. Michael stood opposite, across the grave from me, clenching and unclenching his fists, as if preparing for a fight. When the moment of farewell came, we finally met face to face. "Jack," he said, extending his hand. "Michael," I returned the handshake. His palm was cold and dry. We stood like that for a second or two, sizing each other up, like boxers before a fight. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said neutrally, although I should have said our loss. But for some reason I couldn't. "How nice that you could break away from your important military service." There was a barely noticeable sneer in his voice. Father would have been impressed. "Don't start, Mike," I shook my head. "Not today." He grunted, let go of my hand, and turned away to greet some business partner. The conversation was over before it even began, but I knew it was only the prologue. The real battle for Walter Stone's inheritance was yet to come. The wake was held at the Stone house, as it should be. Women from the local community organized the table. Catherine led the process as if she had been doing it all her life. She flitted among the guests, smiling, hugging old women, shaking hands with men. And she constantly called people by name: Margaret, Ede, Betty, Joe. I watched her from the corner of the room, sipping whiskey. Something in this picture grated on my nerves like a splinter. She was too natural for someone who supposedly had never been to Pine Ridge before. Something elusive, huh? As if reading my thoughts, a familiar voice said. I turned around. Harris Peterson, an old foreman from the sawmill, stood nearby, holding a glass of orange juice. He had leukemia, already at an advanced stage, judging by the yellowish tint of his skin. "Hi, Harris." I shook his hand, surprised at how light, almost bird-like it had become. "Good to see you." "A lie, but I appreciate the politeness." He grinned with his toothless mouth. "You feel it too, don't you? Something's not right in this house. I've spent more time in it than you've lived, boy, and trust the old man, the walls remember. And these walls say that something bad happened here." I looked at him intently. "What are you talking about, Harris?" "Your father wasn't a saint, Jackie, you know that, but he had principles. He never took more than he needed, not from people, not from the forest." Peterson paused, coughing into his fist. "But your brother, he's a different breed, or he's become one in recent years. Stop by the sawmill tomorrow, you'll see for yourself." I nodded, about to ask for more details. But at that moment Michael came up to us, putting his hand on the old man's shoulder. "Harris, you should save your strength," he said with a forced smile. "In your condition." "I'm dying, Mikey, not losing my mind," Peterson snapped, but allowed Michael to lead him to a group of other guests. I rubbed my forehead, feeling the headache intensify. Through the crowd, I noticed Tommy sitting on the bottom step of the stairs with a book in his hands, his eternal way of shutting himself off from the world. But something caught his attention, and he raised his head, looking somewhere in the corner of the living room. I followed his gaze and saw Catherine and Michael standing close together, talking in hushed tones. They were standing too close, like old acquaintances, not people who had met a couple of hours ago. Michael leaned into her ear, whispered something, and Catherine smiled slightly, not a polite smile of the hostess, but a real, personal smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. He put his hand on her forearm and squeezed it slightly, and she didn't pull away. I moved towards them, but Anthony Larkin, an old friend of my father's, blocked my path. "Jack, my boy, so many years. And I remember you running under the table at your grandfather's anniversary, in your underwear and with a little gun." I had to stop and listen to a long story from my childhood, from which I was distracted only by Tommy's quiet voice. "Dad," he tugged at my sleeve, Catherine is talking to Uncle Michael over there. I saw it, buddy, I replied. It's just politeness. No, Tommy shook his head. I accidentally heard a bit. She said something like everything is going according to plan, and then Uncle Michael mentioned the will and said that he doesn't even suspect. I don't know what they were talking about, but when I got closer, Catherine immediately stopped talking and smiled at me, but somehow strangely. I looked at my son, and for the first time in a long time, I really saw him. Not a little boy clinging to his mother's photos, but an observant, smart person who understood much more than he showed. Thanks for telling me, I squeezed his shoulder. Let's get you something to eat, huh? For the rest of the evening, I stayed closer to Catherine, but she seemed to notice the change in my behavior and was impeccably attentive as a wife. Michael, on the other hand, disappeared soon after his short conversation with her, citing urgent business. When the last guests finally left, I felt like I had completed a 50-mile forced march with full gear. Tommy had been asleep for a long time, and Catherine and I were cleaning up the leftovers in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Who could that be so late? Catherine frowned. I opened the door and saw a tall, thin man with a receding hairline and sad eyes. He was holding a leather briefcase and had that characteristic look that only lawyers and undertakers have. Harold Finch, he introduced himself, extending his hand. The Stones family lawyer. Jack Stone, I shook his hand. Come in. Finch entered the house, casting a quick glance at Catherine, who appeared in the living room doorway. Mrs. Stone, he nodded to her dryly, my condolences for your loss. Thank you, she smiled tensely. Can I offer you some coffee? No, thank you. I won't be long. Finch turned to me. I came to inform you that the official reading of Walter Stone's will take place in 3 days at my office. The presence of all interested parties is mandatory. Of course, I nodded. Thanks for letting us know in person. Catherine came closer, her smile becoming more strained. Mr. Finch, is it possible to know, even in general terms, what to expect? It would help us prepare. The lawyer looked at her with that special look that lawyers have when they're looking at witnesses trying to hide something. I'm afraid, Mrs. Stone, that I cannot disclose the contents of the will until the official reading. These are the rules and the wishes of the deceased. He turned to me again. May I speak with you privately, Mr. Stone? Catherine hesitated for a second, but then nodded. Of course, I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. When she left, Finch lowered his voice. Your father had something to say to you, Jack, and not everyone will be happy with his last words. What do you mean? I cannot be more specific, Finch shook his head. But I've known your father for 40 years, and he changed a lot in the last year of his life. I think you will be surprised. I heard footsteps behind me and turned around. Michael was standing in the doorway, holding a glass of whiskey. I didn't hear him come in. He must have used the back door. His fingers were gripping the glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Finch, he nodded to the lawyer, snooping around. Good evening, Michael, Finch replied calmly. I was just leaving. See you in 3 days. The lawyer said goodbye quickly and left, leaving my brother and me in awkward silence. He's been here the whole time. Michael nodded towards the stairs, referring to Tommy. Yes, but he's asleep now. It was a hard day for the boy. Michael took a sip of whiskey, for all of us. He looked exhausted, but there was a feverish fire in his eyes that I remembered well from childhood. That's how Michael looked when something wasn't going according to his plan. I think we should talk, I said, about the sawmill about. Not tonight, he interrupted me. I just came to see if everything was okay. Get some rest, Jack. We're in for some tough days. With those words, he finished his whiskey in one gulp, put the glass on the table by the door, and left. A minute later, I heard his Jeep start. Later, after tucking Tommy, who was already asleep improperly, it's harmful for him to sleep in his clothes, I noticed how tense his face was even in his sleep. like a little soldier, ready to jump up and defend himself at any moment. "She's pretending, Dad," he suddenly whispered, opening his eyes. "Who?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Catherine, she's not who she seems to be." I stroked his head, trying to find the right words. "Everything will be okay, buddy. I'll take care of everything." Tommy nodded and closed his eyes again, but I could see that he didn't believe me. And he was right not to, because I didn't believe my own words. I felt the clouds gathering around me, and soon there would be a storm for which I wasn't ready. And the worst part was the thought that my own wife and brother might be at the very center of that storm. The last thing I saw before leaving my son's room was a tattered notebook on his bedside table, a diary that Tommy had kept since he was 8, after his mother's death. On the cover was a sticker with a handwritten note: "No one will know how I really feel." I mentally repeated those words as I closed the door to the room. It seems my 12-year-old son understood this town and its secrets better than I did. Chapter 2: Suspicions. The morning after my father's funeral was dank and gray. Fog lay between the pines like a ghostly sea, muffling sounds, turning familiar outlines into blurred silhouettes. I got up before dawn, leaving Catherine asleep, or pretending to be asleep, and quietly went downstairs. Putting on my father's old jacket that was hanging in the hallway, I went out onto the porch. In the army, I got used to getting up with the first rays of the sun. Some habits stay with you, even when there's no need to keep your weapon ready or check the perimeter. Sometimes it seemed to me that Tommy had inherited that trait too, waking up before everyone else, being alert. Though probably not from me, more likely from his mother. Mary hardly slept in the last months of her life because of the pain. I started my father's old pickup truck that was collecting dust in the garage. The engine coughed like a smoker with 40 years of experience, but still started. The smell inside was the same: tobacco, engine oil, and pine needles. It's strange how memory works sometimes. You forget the face of an old friend, but you remember the smell of your father's car 15 years later. The drive to the sawmill took about 10 minutes. From the outside, everything looked almost the same as in my childhood: a high fence, a gate with the sign "Stone Lumber Quality since 1923, huge stacks of logs. But when I drove inside, it became clear that it was just a facade. The yard was unkempt, the equipment was ancient, and the few workers who had already started working greeted me with wary glances. Jack Stone, an elderly man with disheveled gray hair, came out of the guardhouse. I'll be darned. Old Harris Peterson, the one we talked to at the wake. He looked even worse in daylight. His skin was yellow, and his eyes were too shiny. Leukemia in its final stages, as I understood. Harris, I shook his dry hand, decided to take a look around. "I thought you'd finally decided to take the reins," he chuckled. "Come on, I'll show you what your father's pride has turned into." We slowly, Harris barely moved his legs, walked around the sawmill. What I saw made me clench my teeth. Outdated equipment, dangerous working conditions, a lack of basic safety measures. "It's been getting worse and worse for the last 2 years, Harris said, leaning on the metal railing of the observation platform. "Michael takes orders that we physically can't fulfill with our capacity. We have to cut corners, sacrifice quality." "Why do the workers put up with it?" I asked, looking down at where 3 men without protective masks were loading planks into a truck. "Where else are they gonna go?" Peterson coughed into a handkerchief. "This is Pine Ridge, boy. It's either the sawmill or a suitcase train station, Portland. Not everyone has the courage to run away like you did." I was silent, swallowing the insult. Though what right did I have to be offended? I really did run away. "And what about the finances?" I asked, changing the subject. Harris shrugged. "Michael handles the accounting himself. He doesn't like anyone sticking their nose in his books. Even your father hasn't had access to them lately." On the way back, I noticed something that I didn't see at first. In the far corner of the yard stood 3 brand new trucks with the sawmill logo. They sharply contrasted with the rest of the dilapidated equipment. Where did those beauties come from? I nodded towards them. Harris frowned. They showed up last year. Michael says he leased them. And you believe him? Listen, Jack. Peterson lowered his voice, although there was no one nearby. I know how things are going. We barely make ends meet. Where did your brother get the money for toys like that? The question hung in the air. I didn't know the answer, but I intended to find it. We stopped at the gate. Harris looked at me for a long time, as if wanting to add something, but hesitated. Spit it out, I said. What else is there? If you really decide to stay and set things right, be careful, he finally said. Your father started asking questions shortly before he died, and it seems to me, he trailed off, shaking his head. What? Finish it, Harris. It seems to me that's why he suddenly burned out from cancer so quickly. Peterson made air quotes. The doctors said they had never seen such a rapid progression of the disease. He patted me on the shoulder with his bird-like hand and hobbled back to the guardhouse, leaving me alone with the cold spreading inside. The cancer that killed my father in a matter of weeks had always seemed like a strange coincidence to me, especially for a man who had spent his whole life in the fresh air and never smoked. When I got back home, there was a strange tension in the kitchen. Catherine was making breakfast, humming some tune, but her shoulders were unnaturally tense. Tommy was sitting at the table, engrossed in a book, and casting wary glances at his stepmother from under his brows. Good morning, honey, Catherine smiled as I walked in. Did you take a drive around town? Went to the sawmill. I poured myself a coffee. Doesn't look good. Oh, Michael said something about modernizing next quarter. She waved her hand dismissively, flipping a pancake. You know how hard it is to keep a family business afloat these days. I looked at her intently. How do you know what Michael said? Catherine froze for a moment, but quickly recovered. He mentioned it yesterday at the wake. We talked for a while, remember? I decided not to press it, not yet. Tommy, what are you going to do today? I asked my son. He shrugged without looking up from his book. I don't know, read, I guess. Why don't you explore the house? I suggested. There are lots of interesting rooms here. When I was your age, I loved playing hide-and-seek with Uncle Michael, especially on rainy days. Tommy finally looked up. There was a glimmer of interest in his eyes. Really? Of course. Go to Granddad's study on the second floor. There's a whole bookcase of old books, some from the 19th century, and photo albums. After breakfast, Catherine went to freshen up, as if she ever looked imperfect, and I went up to my father's former room, now turned into a guest bedroom. An hour or so later, I heard a quiet knock on the door. Dad, Tommy poked his head through the crack. Can I come in? Of course, come on in. He came in, clutching a tattered leather-bound photo album to his chest. I found this in Granddad's study, he said, sitting down next to me on the bed. There are so many old photos in here. We started flipping through the album together. I was surprised to find that I had never seen many of the pictures. My father must have added them after I left. My graduation, Michael in a suit at some reception, my father fishing with Sheriff Bobby. Who's this? Tommy pointed to a photo where Michael and I, very young, were standing with fishing rods on the shore of a lake, smiling broadly. So happy and carefree that I hardly recognized myself. That's me and Uncle Michael, I said. I was 16 here, he was 19. It was good fishing, I remember. We caught a huge perch. At that moment the door flew open and Catherine entered the room. Seeing the album in Tommy's hands, she changed her face, her eyes narrowed, and her smile disappeared. What are you doing here? She came closer. Just old photos, I replied. Tommy found an album in Dad's study. I see, Catherine literally snatched the album from the boy's hands. I don't think you should be rummaging through the deceased's things, Tommy. It's disrespectful to the memory. and there's so much dust in there, you might have an allergy." "But I—" "No buts," she snapped. "Go wash your hands, there's dust everywhere." Tommy gave me a helpless look, but I nodded almost imperceptibly, letting him know that I would take care of it. When he left, I turned to Catherine. "What was that?" "What?" She blinked innocently. "Just taking care of the boy's health. You know how sensitive his skin is." "Tommy doesn't have any allergies, Catherine." "Doesn't he?" She looked genuinely surprised. "I was sure. God, I'm sorry. I must have confused him with my friend's son. The last few days have been so stressful." She gave me the album back and left, saying she needed to make a call. I waited until her footsteps faded in the hallway and then quietly followed her. I slowly went down the stairs and stopped, hearing Catherine's voice from my father's study. "He's here," she was saying quietly. "Everything is going according to plan. No, the boy doesn't know anything, but he's too curious. Yes, tomorrow, of course, I'll handle it." I quickly retreated when she finished the conversation, but my thoughts were racing. What plan was she talking about? And who was she calling? By noon, I decided to meet with Sheriff Bobby. If anyone could shed light on what was happening, it was him, my cousin, once my best friend and now the law in Pine Ridge. I found him at Millie's diner, where he seemed to have lunch every day. The waitress brought him his order without even asking. "Hey, cuz," I sat across from him. "You don't mind, do you?" Bobby flinched and nervously adjusted his badge, a gesture I had noticed at the funeral. "Jack, I thought you were already getting ready to go back." "I was, but circumstances came up." I smiled at the waitress ordering coffee. "You know, family matters." Bobby was the same age as Michael, but looked older than both of us, stocky, with tired eyes and an unkempt mustache. We used to be inseparable, me, Michael, and Bobby, always getting into trouble. Now there seemed to be a gulf between us. "How's Sarah?" I asked about Bobby's wife, trying to ease the tension. "Better," he smiled weakly. "The doctors say she's in remission, but you know, with that stuff, you never know for sure." I nodded. Sarah had been battling lymphoma for several years. I had heard from mutual acquaintances. Treatment cost a fortune, especially for the sheriff of a small town. "Listen, Bobby," I decided to get down to business. "What's going on at the sawmill? I was there this morning and things don't look good." The sheriff tensed, his gaze darting to the door as if looking for a way out. "Nothing special. The usual difficulties of a small business. Michael is doing everything he can." "Really?" And I heard there were complaints about the sawmill from environmentalists. Something about illegal logging. Bobby paled sharply and adjusted his badge again. "Where did you— It's all nonsense. Some city activists who don't understand how forestry works." "What about Dad's will?" I decided to come at it from another angle. "They say he changed it shortly before he died." "Everything will be clear at the reading of the will," the sheriff snapped. "Listen, Jack, I know you think you can come back and control everything, but you've been gone for 15 years. 15. Michael has kept the business afloat all this time. Don't get involved in this, I'm asking you." He was talking faster and faster, and I noticed that he was started to shake. His right hand started to slightly tremble, a sure sign of stress. "I'm just trying to figure out what—" "Oh shoot," Bobby suddenly looked at his watch. "I need to go, urgent call on the outskirts. Sorry, cuz." He threw money on the table for his lunch, frantically buttoned up his jacket, and almost ran out of the diner. I slowly finished my coffee, watching through the window as Bobby, instead of getting into the patrol car, nervously looked around and called someone on his mobile phone. His face was as dark as a thundercloud. In the evening, returning home, I discovered that Catherine was absent. Tommy was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV, but his tense pose betrayed that something was wrong. "Hey, buddy," I sat next to him. "Where's Catherine?" "She said she had a headache and went to the pharmacy," he replied, without taking his eyes off the screen, where some cartoon was playing. But that was 3 hours ago. I frowned. 3 hours. It's a 10-minute drive to the nearest pharmacy, tops. Tommy finally turned to me, and I saw fear in his eyes. I saw her drive away, but not towards town, towards the lake, in the opposite direction. Are you sure? He nodded. I was standing at the window upstairs. I wanted to call you, but she took my phone, said she would charge it but didn't give it back. I took out my mobile and dialed Catherine's number. After 6 rings, voicemail came on. I sent a message. No reply. Listen, Tommy, I took my son by the shoulders. You need to tell me if anything else happened, anything strange or scary. He bit his lip, just like Mary used to do when she was nervous, and finally decided. This morning when you left and I found the album, she didn't just take it away from me. She grabbed my arm and squeezed it so hard it hurt. And then I overheard her phone conversation. She told someone that everything is going according to plan and that I was too curious. Dad, who was she calling? And what plan? I pulled him close, feeling anger rising inside. No one has the right to intimidate my son, especially the woman I entrusted to take care of him. I'll sort this out, I promise, I said. In the meantime, stay away from her, okay? Tommy nodded. Together we cooked a simple dinner of macaroni and cheese and reheated frozen meatballs, watched an old Western on TV. Around 9 o'clock I heard a car pull up. Go upstairs, I whispered to my son, and lock the door, I'll be right there. Catherine walked into the house, looking impeccable as always. Only a slight blush on her cheeks and slightly tousled hair betrayed that she had been in the fresh air. And also the smell, definitely, men's cologne. Oh, you've already had dinner, she smiled, seeing the dirty dishes. Sorry, honey, I didn't think I'd be so late. Where were you, Catherine? I asked directly. At the pharmacy, she took off her coat. I had a headache. 3 hours. She paused for a moment, but quickly recovered. Oh God, you won't believe it. I met Jennifer Parker, my friend from college. She was passing through town to visit relatives in Portland. We decided to have coffee and chat. I completely lost track of time. Jennifer Parker, college friend, passing through Pine Ridge. It all sounded horribly fake. What college did you go to together? I asked, watching her. Catherine hesitated for a second. At Bates, of course, I told you. Yes, exactly, I lied. Catherine always said she graduated from Cornell. Anyway, sorry for making you worry. She came closer, putting her hands on my shoulders. How about I make it up to you? Her eyes promised a lot, but she smelled of someone else's men's cologne, and every instinct screamed that this woman was lying to my face. Not tonight, I gently stepped away. Tomorrow is an important day. We all need to rest. Disappointment flashed across Catherine's face, but she quickly hid it behind a smile. Of course, honey, as you wish. The next morning, Tommy woke up before everyone else. I found him in the kitchen, devouring cereal with milk and reading one of the old books he had discovered in Granddad's study. Did you sleep well? I ruffled his hair. Yep, he smiled. I'm going to explore the rest of the house today. Great, just be careful with the old things, okay? I made coffee for myself and Catherine, who was still asleep, and began sorting through my father's papers that I had found in the desk drawer. My thoughts were occupied with the upcoming reading of the will, scheduled for tomorrow. What was so special about it that Finch told me to be prepared for surprises? And why was everyone so tense? Around noon, Tommy burst into the kitchen, breathless and with wide eyes. Dad. What happened? I jumped up, ready for the worst. I overheard something. He lowered his voice. Uncle Michael is here. He's in the garage, talking on the phone, and he's very angry. Michael's here. His car wasn't in the driveway. He left it outside the gate. I saw it from the window. Tommy spoke so quietly that I could barely make out the words. I was near the garage, about to look at the old bikes, and I heard his voice. He was yelling at someone on the phone. What was he saying? Tommy swallowed. He said, I don't care about your excuses. If federal inspectors get to those sites, we're all screwed. Shut them up at any cost, got it? And then he called someone else and said, Bobby, we need to meet. Now, the will, yes, I know you can't change it, but there are other ways to solve the problem. If Jack stays. What happened then? I tensed up. I stepped on some board, it creaked, and I was afraid he would hear me. I ran away. I hugged Tommy, feeling him tremble. You did the right thing. Stay in the house and stay with me or Catherine, okay? Just not with her, he said quietly. Please. Okay, I nodded. Then just stay within my sight. We walked out of the kitchen, and almost immediately Tommy ran into Catherine, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. She was looking at him with undisguised suspicion. What were you doing near the garage, Tommy? Eavesdropping. I was just looking at the bikes. He stepped back, instinctively clinging to me. Really? Catherine raised an eyebrow. It seemed to me you were circling around like a little spy. Catherine, my voice became firmer. What's the problem? Tommy is just exploring the house as I suggested. Of course, honey, she instantly changed her tone. I'm just worried. The old garage is dangerous. There are so many rusty tools there. He could get hurt. Her concern sounded fake, like cheap plastic trying to imitate expensive leather. But I pretended to believe it. We'll be careful. Besides, the boy needs space to explore. At his age, I climbed all over the house and the surrounding area. Catherine smiled, but her eyes remained cold. As you say, dear. By the way, Michael called. He wants to meet with you tonight. Says it's time for you to talk like brothers. Is that so? I met her gaze. I wonder when he called. I didn't hear the phone. Oh, on your mobile. She took my phone out of her robe pocket. He called when you were in the shower, I answered. I took the phone, feeling growing anxiety. Catherine was definitely hiding something, and Michael seemed to be involved in it. But one thing I was sure of, I wouldn't leave Tommy alone with her for a minute. Dinner that evening was like a theatrical performance, where everyone played their role, but no one had an appetite. Catherine bustled around the table, setting out the food, smiling at me, and casting sharp glances at Tommy when she thought I wasn't looking. The boy barely touched his food, moving pieces of meat around the plate like chess pieces. How was your day, honey? Catherine asked, putting potatoes on my plate. Did you find anything interesting in your father's papers? Nothing special, I lied, although in fact I had discovered several strange invoices related to some company, Blue Ridge Logging, that I had never heard of. Dad, Tommy suddenly spoke. Today I heard how. Tommy liked the old books in Granddad's study so much, Catherine interrupted him. I think we should take some with us when we go back to Boston. What do you think, Jack? I noticed how she literally stared at the boy and he fell silent, lowering his head. Pain and anger squeezed my heart. Who did she think she was, to intimidate my son? We'll see, I replied briefly. Tommy, you wanted to say something. No, nothing. He shook his head without raising his eyes. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Oh, that must be Michael. Catherine jumped up from her seat. Michael walked into the dining room, looking somewhat rumpled and nervous. He nodded briefly to me, ruffled Tommy's hair, and settled into the chair opposite. Sorry for intruding on the family idol, he said with a slight smirk. But I thought it was time for us to talk, especially before tomorrow's event. Dinner, Catherine offered, already reaching for an extra plate. No thanks, Michael shook his head. I already ate. Actually, Jack, I thought we should go hunting tomorrow. Remember the old times, talk like brothers, without lawyers and officialdom. There was something insincere about his offer, but I saw it as an opportunity to find out the truth. Why not? I agreed. When was the last time we spent time as brothers? 15 years ago. Michael winced slightly. Yeah, about that much, since you left. An awkward silence fell, broken by Tommy. Can I come too? No, Michael and Catherine exclaimed simultaneously, then exchanged glances. I mean, that's not the best idea, buddy, Michael softened. We're going far into the woods, it's going to be a tough route. Besides, your father and I need to discuss adult matters, some other time. Catherine will take care of you, I added, watching their reaction carefully. Something flashed between them, some signal, understandable only to them. That's great, Catherine smiled. Tommy and I will have a wonderful time. Maybe I'll show him how to bake a blueberry pie using my grandmother's recipe. Michael soon excused himself, agreeing to meet me at dawn. When I walked him to the door, he squeezed my shoulder a little harder than simple politeness required. Everything will be clear tomorrow, brother, and in the evening we will read the will. I hope we can resolve everything as a family. After he left, I helped Catherine clear the table and then went upstairs to tuck Tommy in. When I came out of his room, I saw Catherine standing in the hallway, as if listening in. Is everything okay? I asked. Of course, honey, she smiled. Just checking if you needed anything. We're fine, thanks. I walked past her into the bedroom, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that she lingered for a moment at Tommy's door. And when I came back from the bathroom, I heard the end of a conversation. Keep your curious nose out of adult matters, boy. Catherine's voice was quiet, but there was an undisguised threat in it. For your own good. I froze, feeling a wave of anger rising inside. But before I could do anything, she came out of my son's room and walked past me, exuding the scent of jasmine perfume. Her smile was serene, but her eyes resembled ice. Good night, honey. Tomorrow is an important day. Chapter 3: Exposure. Dawn barely marked the horizon when I stepped onto the porch and saw Michael sitting in my father's old Jeep. He looked pale and sleepless, deep shadows under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. Here, take this. He handed me a thermos as I sat down next to him. Black, no sugar. You still drink it like that? I nodded, surprised he remembered such a small detail. The Jeep moved off, the ancient engine growling like an angry bear. We drove in silence until the town was left behind. Fog lay over the forest road, transforming the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. I took a sip of coffee. Where are we going? North, Michael replied laconically. You can also see what I've been doing these 15 years, while you were playing soldier. His pale smile could hardly be called friendly. I took another sip of coffee and stared out the window, where the pines flashed by in an endless green stream. A strange calmness took hold of me, the same one I felt before military operations. Time seemed to slow down, while feelings, on the contrary, sharpened. Half an hour later, the Jeep turned onto a dirt road, going deep into the forest, which I did not remember. New road? I asked. Built 3 years ago, Michael nodded. Otherwise, you can't get to these sites. After another 10 minutes, the landscape subtly changed. The forest thinned out and then simply disappeared. Before us opened a panorama that squeezed the throat, a huge space, where recently the pine forest rustled, turned into a lunar landscape. Hundreds of stumps sticking out of the ground like severed fingers, soil scarred by the tracks of heavy equipment, piles of felled branches. Further, as far as the eye could see, stretched the same wasteland. My God, I breathed, what the hell happened here? Michael stopped the Jeep and turned off the engine. Necessary measures to save the business. His voice contained poorly hidden aggression. Father was too conservative. He didn't know how to take risks. I got out of the car, trying to realize the scale of the disaster. This is stop. We're already beyond the stone estate. This is a protected area. Are you illegally logging here? And you're observant, Michael smirked, nervously twisting the sleeve of his jacket. Environmental laws are for rich corporations that can afford the luxury of caring about some pine tree. And we had debts, Jack. Huge debts. Someone had to take responsibility while you were playing hero around the world. This is illegal, I shook my head. If the feds find out. You abandoned us for 15 years. Michael suddenly exploded, his face contorted with rage. 15, and now you come back and think you can judge. At this moment he was frighteningly reminiscent of his father, the same curve of the mouth, the same knuckles whitened with tension. Walter Stone also never knew how to control his anger. I'm not judging, I said calmly. I'm trying to understand. There's nothing to understand, Michael turned away. What's done is done. If the feds get here, we're screwed, all of us. Including Sheriff Bobby. Michael turned sharply. What do you know? Enough, I met his gaze, and with each passing day more and more. The air between us almost rang with tension. I noticed that Michael's hand instinctively jerked towards his belt, but there was no weapon there. He came to his senses and laughed hoarsely. You were always like this, asking questions, digging around, just like Dad before he died. It sounded almost like a threat. We stood in the middle of the destroyed forest, two brothers, separated by much more than 15 years and thousands of miles. We drove back in complete silence. Michael dropped me off at the house and drove away, throwing at the farewell. I'll see you tonight at Finch's. Maybe you should think about Tommy's future before making rash decisions. The house was quiet. Catherine was found in the kitchen. She was singing something, making lunch. Looking at me, she smiled her porcelain smile. How was the hunt, honey? Did you shoot anything? Not today, I walked past her. Where's Tommy? In his room, reading. Her voice became cooler. Honey, are you okay? You're kind of tense. Everything's fine, tired. I went upstairs and quietly knocked on my son's door. Not waiting for an answer, I looked in. Tommy was sitting on the bed, hugging his knees to his chest, and didn't even lift his head. Hey, buddy, I sat next to him. How are you? Silence. I noticed that he was clutching his diary in the tattered cover, a sign that something was bothering him a lot. Tommy, what happened? He finally raised his eyes, and I saw fear in them. Dad, she's watching me. Catherine. After you left, she rummaged through your things and then called someone and said that we need to get out of here as soon as possible. I froze. She said that we need to leave. Yes, and then I accidentally bumped into her in the hallway when I went for a book, and his voice trembled. She grabbed my arm so hard that there were bruises. Tommy rolled up his sleeve and I saw clear fingerprints on his forearm. Something inside me broke. I would have forgiven Catherine a lot, lies, manipulations, even betrayal, but never inflicting pain on my son. Why didn't you tell me right away? I asked, trying to speak softly. I was afraid, he whispered. She said that if I told you, you wouldn't believe me, that you would think I made it all up because I don't want you to have a new wife. I hugged him tightly, feeling anger boiling in my chest. Listen to me, Tommy. I will always believe you here, always, and no one, not Catherine, not anyone else, will ever harm you. I stepped back and looked him in the eyes. From now on, I want you not to be alone with Catherine. If I suddenly go somewhere, you go with me. Understood? He nodded, and there was such relief on his face that my heart ached. How long had he been living with this fear? So what are we going to do now? He asked. First, I'll find out what's going on, I said, and then we'll decide what to do next. I helped him hide his diary in a new place between the mattress and the bed frame, and we went down for lunch. Catherine was bustling at the stove, looking perfect as always. She smiled, discussed the weather, asked Tommy about the books he was reading. If I hadn't seen the bruises on my son's arm, I might have believed that she was really a caring stepmother. But now I saw through her, and I was gradually beginning to understand what had bothered me from the very beginning. Her eyes never smiled along with her lips. In the evening, I told Catherine that I was going to meet an army friend who was passing through town. She swallowed this lie easily, maybe, because she was constantly lying herself. I left Tommy with clear instructions to lock himself in his room and not open it to anyone, even Catherine. He was clutching my father's old mobile in his hand, which I had found in the study, just in case. I hid the car around the corner and returned on foot, hiding under a sprawling elm at the end of the driveway. Half an hour later, Catherine came out of the house. She had changed into tight jeans and a blouse with a deep neckline, not the outfit she usually wore around the house. Catherine got into her car and drove away. I followed her at a safe distance, thankfully. Traffic was so light in Pine Ridge that it was hard to lose a car from sight. She turned onto the road leading to the lake. After a few miles, an old hunting cabin appeared, owned by the Larkin family. Catherine parked next to a familiar Jeep that was already there. Michael. I left the car around the corner and crept closer, hiding behind the trees. Years in the Special Forces had not been in vain. Moving silently was as natural to me as breathing. Through the loosely drawn curtains I saw them. Catherine and Michael stood in the middle of the room, lit only by a kerosene lamp. He pulled her to him, and they kissed, not fleetingly and chastely, but deeply and passionately, like longtime lovers starving for each other. "I can't take it anymore," Catherine said when they broke apart. "Pretending to be a loving wife, living with this son of his. He keeps looking at me like he suspects something." "Just bear with it a little longer," Michael hugged her. "The will disappoint Jack and he'll leave. And if the will isn't what we expect and he doesn't leave, we have a plan B." I didn't immediately realize that the dry branch under my foot had crunched too loudly. Michael turned sharply, peering into the darkness. I froze, blending into the shadow of the tree. "What is it?" Catherine tensed up. "Nothing," he shook his head. "Probably a deer." They returned to their conversation while I struggled with the desire to burst in and wring both of their necks. The rational part of my mind, the one that had kept me alive in the hottest spots on the planet, was saying, "Listen, gather information, don't act on emotions." "When did you talk to Finch?" Catherine asked, sitting down on the well-worn couch. "Yesterday." Michael took a beer out of the refrigerator. "He claims he can't change anything. The will is the will." "Did he hint at anything?" "No, but from the way he avoids looking me in the eye, I'm almost sure my father pulled some trick in the end." Michael squeezed the can hard. It crumpled, spilling foam. "Damn old man. Even from the grave he continues to control." Catherine approached him, putting her hands on his shoulders. "Calm down, honey. We already discussed this. If Jack gets the sawmill, he'll sell it. What's the point of him staying in this dump? And you'll offer to buy out his share. He'll agree. He has a son. He needs money. And if not," Michael's face distorted, "if he decides to stay and dig further, he's a former soldier, Cat. I saw his look this morning. He suspects something." She touched his face. "Then we'll implement Plan B. No Jack, no problem." I felt everything inside grow cold. These two seemed to be seriously discussing the possibility of killing me. "And what the hell is this Plan B?" Michael stepped away from her. "You make it sound so simple, no Jack, no problem. But you don't say how exactly." "The less you know, the better you sleep," Catherine smiled predatorily. "Just trust me. I didn't just spend 2 years ingratiating myself to him." 2 years. So their affair started even before Catherine and I met. "Sometimes you scare me," Michael shook his head. "Did you think the timid survive in our world?" She laughed. "It's just business, honey, nothing personal." I retreated silently, having heard enough. To avoid risking being discovered, I went around the cabin and headed to the car. Inside me, a storm of emotions was raging, but on top of them, like a thin layer of ice, lay an icy calmness. Most of all, I was struck not even by Catherine's betrayal. In the depths of my soul, I had always felt the falseness in our relationship. I was struck by how skillfully she manipulated both of us. Michael seemed to really love her, while for her, he was just a figure in the game. I didn't know what Plan B she had prepared, but I was sure of one thing. If Tommy's safety was at stake, I wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. Returning home, I waited for Catherine to fall asleep, or pretend to fall asleep, and went to my father's study. I had moved Tommy into my room on a cot next to the bed. He was sleeping soundly, looking peaceful for the first time in days. In the study, I began methodically checking everything in a row: bookshelves, panels, floorboards. My old man was a paranoid. There had to be a hiding place somewhere. Finally, I moved a heavy picture depicting the sawmill on the day it opened. Behind it, there was a safe built into the wall, a classic that Walter Stone must have spied on in some ancient film noir. The combination: I tried the standard options: the date of birth of my father, mother, wedding day. Nothing. Then it dawned on me. Father was stubborn but not without humor. I entered his date of birth backwards. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside lay neat stacks of papers, a flash drive, and an old revolver, the same one my father taught Michael and me to shoot at cans in the backyard. I began browsing the documents, and the further I went, the colder my blood became. Schematics, invoices, bank transfers, everything pointed to a large-scale money laundering operation through the sawmill. Michael was receiving orders for illegal logging of protected forests from the company Blue Ridge Logging, which, apparently, was a front. Sheriff Bobby was providing cover from federal environmental inspections, receiving a hefty share for it. The last in the stack was a letter from my father to lawyer Finch, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Harold, I have to change my will, not just for the sake of the business, but for Michael's soul. I realized too late that I had ruined my sons by trying to make them stronger through eternal rivalry. Now I see how Michael is going to any length, even crime, to prove to me what he's worth. Jack has learned to value life, having gone through war and personal tragedy. He will be able to restore honor to the family. I'm making him the main heir to the sawmill, but on one condition. He must keep jobs for the people, many of whom have worked for us for decades. And finally get rid of Michael's machinations, returning a good reputation to my family name on the grave. I hope it's not too late to fix everything. Walter Stone. I sank into my father's chair, feeling something catch in my throat. Did the old man really change in the end? Realize his mistakes? Or was this another manipulation, the last attempt to control our lives from the grave? I remembered how Harris mentioned that my father had started asking questions shortly before his death, and suddenly burned out from cancer with suspicious speed. I remembered how Ray said in the cafe, no one deserved such an end. What if my father's death was not natural? Could Michael have? I shook my head, chasing away the thought. No matter how ambitious and confused my brother was, I couldn't believe he was capable of patricide. On the other hand, until a week ago, I couldn't believe that he was sleeping with my wife and planning to get rid of me. Carefully collecting all the documents, I hid them back in the safe, pulling out only my father's letter and the revolver. Strangely, there were no cartridges for it in the safe. The morning of the day the will was to be read was unusually clear. After my nightly discoveries, I barely slept, checking the documents, but I felt remarkably collected. Tommy paced nervously around the room while I shaved. He tried to look calm, but he was betrayed by restless movements and how he kept glancing at the window. "Are you okay, buddy?" I asked, wiping my face with a towel. "We need to leave, Dad," he said suddenly, "right now before the reading of the will." I looked at my son intently. "Why do you think so?" Tommy bit his lip. At night I woke up from the noise and looked into the hallway. Uncle Michael and Catherine were whispering. He was saying something like, if he doesn't give up nicely, we'll have to act otherwise. There it was, Plan B. "Thanks for telling me." I put my hands on my son's shoulders. "But you know what? We're not going to run away." I lowered my voice to a whisper. "I found out the truth about what's going on, about the sawmill, about Catherine and Michael, about everything. Now we need to act smart." "What do you mean?" "Today everything will change." I took a small recorder out of the bag that I had bought in town the day before. "I'm going to record today's reading of the will and everything that will be said afterwards, and then you and I will decide together what to do next." Tommy nodded, but his eyes still showed fear. "Do you promise everything will be okay?" "I promise I'll do everything to protect you," I replied honestly. "Always." We hugged, and I felt that somehow this situation had brought us closer together than everything we had gone through after Mary's death. "Be careful today," I said. "Stay close to me and away from Catherine, and don't tell anyone, even former friends of your father, that you know or suspect anything. Do you promise?" Tommy nodded, his eyes serious beyond his years. "I promise, Dad." We didn't notice that the bathroom door was slightly ajar, and Catherine was watching our conversation, her eyes as cold as a snake before a strike. Lawyer Finch's office was located in an old brick building. All the key figures gathered here: me, Michael, Catherine, Sheriff Bobby, and several sawmill employees, including old Harris Peterson, who looked like he was about to crumble. I had left Tommy at home. Although it contradicted my promise not to leave him alone, an official ceremony was no place for a child. I made him promise that he would lock himself in his room and not open it to anyone, even if Catherine suddenly came back earlier. The recorder was quietly working in my jacket pocket. Harold Finch looked tired and tense. He laid out the papers on the table, cleared his throat, and began. "Before I read Walter Stone's will, I want to say that he changed the will 2 weeks before his death. These changes are completely legal, notarized, and reflect his last wishes." Michael visibly tensed. Catherine, sitting next to me, squeezed my hand in a feigned gesture of support. "According to the deceased's will," Finch continued, "control of the stone lumber sawmill passes to Jack Stone, as he has acquired the qualities of a true leader and an understanding of the value of traditions. Michael Stone receives 40% of the company's shares, but without the right to manage. The rest of the property is divided equally between the sons." For a moment there was complete silence. I felt Catherine's hand tense in my palm. Finch continued to read the details, but his words were drowned out by the growing hum in my head. "Father really did it. He gave me the company, despite 15 years of separation. Did he believe that I could fix everything? Or was it his last act of manipulation, an attempt to pit Michael and me against each other one last time?" "This is a forgery." Michael suddenly jumped up, his face pale and then flushed with blood. "The old man would never have done that. Jack somehow manipulated him while he was dying." "Michael, please," Finch raised his hand. "The will is drawn up according to all the rules. Your father was of sound mind." "Of sound mind," Michael laughed, but the laugh sounded almost like a sob. "He was dying of cancer, suffering from pain, and this," he pointed a finger at me, "this deserter returned at the last moment and took everything." "Calm down." I stood up, looking my brother in the eye. "Let's discuss this like adults." "Adults," Michael gasped with rage. "You abandoned the family, abandoned the sawmill. I worked hard for 15 years to save my father's business, and you turned the family business into a cover for money laundering and illegal logging." I finished quietly. Michael froze, as if he had been hit. Sheriff Bobby went white and frantically grabbed his badge, a gesture that now seemed almost comical to me. "What are you talking about?" Catherine stood next to me, her voice trembling with feigned indignation. "Jack, honey, you're not yourself from the stress." "I suggest everyone leave and cool down," the sheriff intervened, casting a glance at me, full of hidden anxiety. "Everyone is too emotional right now." "Good idea." Finch closed the folder. "All the documents will need to be in a week. In the meantime, I sympathize with your loss." Michael flew out of the office first, followed by the sheriff and the others. Only Harris Peterson lingered at the door, giving me a look in which undisguised approval could be read. Catherine did not leave me for a moment as we walked to the car. Her hand holding my elbow felt like a vice. "Honey, do you really want to stay here and run the sawmill?" Her voice was full of poorly hidden anxiety. "It's so unexpected." "I don't know," I lied. "I need to think." "Of course, honey, but whatever you decide, I'm with you." Her words sounded almost sincere, but the bruises on Tommy's arm and the scene in the hut were before my eyes, as if alive. When we returned home, I was the first to go up to check on Tommy. His door was closed but not locked. No one inside. "Tommy!" I looked into the bathroom, into my room, into my father's study. "Empty." "Tommy!" My voice echoed off the walls, but the house answered only with a hollow silence. Catherine was standing in the hallway, her face expressing concern. "What happened, honey? Where's my son?" I grabbed her by the shoulders, barely restraining myself from shaking her properly. "I don't know," she widened her eyes. "I thought he was home where you left him." I let her go and rushed down, checking every nook and cranny of the house. Living room, kitchen, basement, all empty. When I returned to Tommy's room, I noticed something I hadn't seen right away. His diary was lying on the floor as if thrown down in a hurry. And on the bed, pinned with a hunting knife to the pillow, was a note. "Give up the inheritance if you want to see the boy alive." I felt the world around me freeze. Cold ran through my body in a wave, then turned to searing rage. Someone had kidnapped my son. And now that someone will find out that messing with a former Special Forces commander who has had his most precious thing taken away is a fatal mistake. Chapter 4: The Confrontation. Cold, that was my first feeling. Not physical cold, the house was warm, even stuffy. It was cold spreading from within, freezing everything in its path. A cold I had experienced only twice in my life, when I was informed of Mary's death and when my best friend died in Afghanistan. I stood in the middle of Tommy's room, clutching the note in my hand, and the same words kept replaying in my mind. "Give up the inheritance if you want to see the boy alive." Time stretched and then suddenly compressed. Years of training turned on automatically. The brain pushed emotions aside, the body acted on its own. I began methodically examining the room, looking for the slightest clues. Under the bed, I found a torn piece of blue fabric. Just such a shirt was on Tommy this morning. Near the door, scratches on the floor, as if someone was dragging a resisting child. Something in the back of my head told me that Tommy had left these signs deliberately. My smart boy resisted, gave me hints. Pride and horror mixed in my chest, breath caught. "Jack." Catherine stood in the doorway with a shocked expression on her face. She pressed her hands to her cheeks, tears welled up in her eyes. The perfect picture of a caring stepmother concerned about the loss of her stepson. Only her eyes. There was no real fear in them. They remained cold and calculating, like a snake ready to strike. "Oh my God!" She grabbed the note from my hands. "We must call the police immediately." I forced myself to play the role of a grieving father, lost and desperate. "You're right, we need to call Bobby." "I'll make coffee," Catherine touched my shoulder. "You need strength, and then we'll go straight to the sheriff." When she left, I acted quickly. I took the father's revolver from the cache and checked the cartridges that I had bought in town. I took a GPS navigator, old maps of the swamps from my father's office, a hunting knife. Instinct told me that the police was the last place I should be going now. I went downstairs where Catherine was frantically making coffee. Her movements were too rushed, unnatural. She was playing a role but not very well. "Jack, honey," her voice sounded fake, like a cheap plastic violin. "Maybe we should just sign the waiver. It's the only way to save Tommy." There it was. Her real goal broke through the mask. I forced myself to nod. "You're right. I'll sign anything I need to as long as Tommy is safe." I saw her relax, like a snake that had gotten its prey. "I'm going to the sheriff," I said, heading for the door. "I'll go with you," Catherine made a move to follow. No, I replied firmly. Stay here in case they call. I'll handle it myself. She didn't argue, which seemed strange to me. Either she was so confident in her control over the situation, or Tommy was where I was going. Be careful, she said, kissing me. I felt disgust but forced myself not to pull away. Just as I was closing the door, I heard her dialing someone's number on her mobile. Instead of going to the sheriff, I left the car around the corner and returned to the house on foot. Walking around the building, I began methodically examining the area, as taught in Delta. The back porch told me more than any witness. Fresh scratches on the railing, signs of a struggle, footprints of heavy boots in the ground softened after the recent rain. I recognized the tread pattern. The workers of the sawmill wore such boots. The tracks led to the forest road, where the ruts of a recently driven truck were visible. I moved along the edge of the forest, bypassing open spaces. Soon I discovered a trampled path. Someone was in a hurry and didn't care about hiding their tracks. They didn't expect a chase. They thought that I, like an obedient dog, would run to the sheriff or would rush around the house in a panic. I walked quickly without stopping for a minute. My heart was pounding, but not from fatigue, from fear for Tommy. What if I was late? What if Michael decided that the boy was too dangerous as a witness? No, I couldn't allow myself such thoughts. On a bend in the path, I noticed something blue caught on a bush. Another piece of Tommy's shirt. Next to it, on the leaves, drops of blood. Not much, but enough to turn everything inside out. I took out my phone and dialed Michael's number. Mike, my voice trembled, but not from acting, from anger, barely restrained inside. Tommy, he's been kidnapped. There's a note in his room. They demand a waiver of inheritance. Michael didn't answer right away, as if choosing his words. God, Jack, he finally said. Are you sure? Maybe he just went for a walk. With a note pinned to his pillow with a knife, I allowed despair to seep into my voice. Mike, I need your help. I don't know what to do. Of course, brother. Now his voice sounded collected, businesslike. I'm coming right now. We'll organize a search. A second before he hung up, I heard a whisper, a woman's whisper. Catherine. She was telling him what to say next. They were together, discussing how to get rid of me and my son. I quickened my pace, now no longer caring about stealth. The tracks led to the swamps, to the rotting mire, as we called it in childhood. A place that locals avoided because of the quagmire that could drag a person in a matter of minutes. I rounded the last hill and saw it, the old hunting cabin, lost among the swamps. Next to it was one of the new sawmill trucks. On the porch, yawning, Nick Holt was smoking, a thug known for his loyalty to Michael. Taking cover behind the massive trunk of a fallen tree, I took out binoculars from my backpack and aimed them at the windows of the cabin. Through the dirty glass, I saw Tommy sitting in a chair, his hands behind his back tied. Under his eye, a bruise. Next to him, sprawled out, sat Dave Warren, another one of Michael's cronies. Everything inside me turned over. My boy, my Tommy, I would have given everything in the world just to switch his place. The familiar chill before the operation became searing rage. I felt blood poolsing in my temples. Calmly, Jack, think first, act later, as taught. I needed a plan. I couldn't just burst into the cabin. It could put Tommy in danger. I decided to act quietly and deal with the guards one by one. I walked around the clearing, moving silently as I had been trained in the special forces. Nick was still smoking, humming some tune to himself. He didn't hear me, even when I was right behind his back. I gagged him and pressed on the carotid artery, a clean, fast reception. After a few seconds, he slumped into my hands, losing consciousness. I tied him with his own belt and left him under the porch. Getting inside the cabin turned out to be more difficult. I chose the back window, where the gap between the shutters allowed me to see that Dave was sitting with his back to me. Carefully lifting the frame, I slipped inside like a shadow. Dave started to turn to the sound, but it was too late. the handle of the revolver came down on the back of his head. He slid to the floor without even screaming. Tommy's eyes widened in surprise and relief. "Dad," he whispered as I cut the ropes on his wrists, "I knew you'd come." "I will always come for you, buddy," I replied, holding him close. Then I stepped back to examine the bruise and scratch on his forehead. "Who did this to you?" "It was her, Dad," Tommy trembled. "Catherine. She held a knife to my throat while these two tied me up. She said I had always been a hindrance." I clenched my teeth so hard that I almost broke them. "Remember this," I told myself. "Remember what she did to your son." But before I could answer, I heard the sound of an approaching car outside. "We need to run." Now, I picked Tommy up in my arms and slipped out through the back door. We moved through the swamp, trying to stay on the narrow, barely noticeable path. I knew these places since childhood, every dangerous quicksand, every path. Michael and I explored the swamps far and wide, despite my father's strict prohibition. Now that knowledge could save our lives. But it soon became obvious that with Tommy we were moving too slowly. The boy was exhausted, scared, depleted. And in the distance, the voices of pursuers were already heard, the angry cry of Nick, who had woken up and discovered that the prisoner had escaped. I made a difficult decision. Looking around, I found the perfect shelter, dense thickets of reeds in a small dry lowland, surrounded by marshy sludge. A place where no one would go without precise knowledge of a safe path. "Listen to me carefully," I knelt in front of my son. "You will stay here. Whatever happens, don't come out until I get back." "No, Dad, please." There were tears in Tommy's eyes. "This is the only way, buddy." I put a compass in his hand, which I had bought in town yesterday. "If I don't come back before dark, go strictly east. There's a highway there. You'll find help." I covered him with reeds so that he couldn't be seen even from a few steps away. "I love you, Tommy," I said, looking into his frightened eyes, "and I promise I'll be back for you." He nodded, though his lower lip was trembling. "I love you, Dad." I tore a piece of my shirt and left it on a bush away from Tommy's shelter. Then I walked through the mud, leaving clear footprints leading in the opposite direction, bait for the pursuers. In the army, we were taught that if you're being chased, it's better to choose a place for an ambush yourself than to let the enemy corner you. I found the perfect position, a narrow natural dam among the quicksand, where I could hide behind a fallen tree. Here the pursuers would be forced to go one by one, and I would have the advantage. It wasn't even 10 minutes before I heard approaching footsteps. Two figures appeared on the trail. Michael was walking ahead, tense, resolute. Behind him followed Catherine. She no longer looked frightened or concerned. Her eyes scanned the swamp like a predator in search of prey. I cocked my father's revolver. "Jack, thank God you're alive," Catherine exclaimed, noticing me. Her face instantly transformed, becoming the mask of a caring wife again. "Where's Tommy? Is he okay?" "Stand where you are." I raised the revolver, pointing it at them. "What are you doing?" An expression of insulted innocence appeared on her face. "Excellent acting. Jack, honey, it's us. We were looking for you. Michael organized a search party." "Put the gun down, Jack," Michael said firmly. "This has gone too far. Think about the boy." "That's what I'm thinking about," I replied, not lowering the weapon. "Where is he?" Michael asked demandingly. "What did you do with him?" "I hid him in a safe place. I didn't take my eyes off my brother, where you won't find him." "Jack, please." Catherine took another cautious step forward. Her face was full of worry. I wonder how long she had rehearsed this expression in front of the mirror. "You're not yourself. All this stress, inheritance, coming home. Let's just find Tommy and go back to the house. We can figure it all out." I was silent, studying their faces. The gun in my hand trembled slightly. Part of me, a stupid, naive part, still wanted to believe that this was some mistake, that Catherine couldn't have been pretending so skillfully all this time, that my brother couldn't have ordered the kidnapping of his nephew. "Come on, brother," Michael tried to speak calmly. Put down the weapon and we'll talk like before. Remember how in childhood when we had problems, we always solved them together. He took a step forward and I almost pulled the trigger. At the last moment, something stopped me. Perhaps a memory of how Michael stood up for me in front of my father, how he taught me to ride a bike, how he covered for me when I broke my father's watch. This moment of hesitation cost me the advantage. Michael suddenly rushed forward. But instead of attacking me, Michael grabbed Catherine, twisted her arm behind her back, and put a hunting knife to her throat. "Drop the gun, Jack," he commanded, "or your beloved wife will die right here." I looked at this scene and, unexpectedly for myself, laughed. A quiet, bitter laugh that breaks out when you realize the absurdity of the situation. "My beloved wife," I shook my head. "Michael, do you really think that will stop me? She's your lover. She married me at your direction to watch me." Michael froze. His hand with the knife began to shake. "I know everything," I continued, "about how you met in the cabin by the lake, about your plan B if I don't give up the inheritance, about how she manipulated both of us. Ask her." I didn't take my eyes off Catherine. "Ask her if she loved any of us. Do you really believe that the threat to her life will trouble me even a drop? No, brother, you lost. Put down the knife and surrender, both of you." There was silence, broken only by the croaking of frogs and the rustling of the wind in the reeds. Michael looked at Catherine, trying to catch her eye. But she was only looking at me, and in her eyes there was such hatred that the air seemed to thicken around us. "Damn it!" Michael lowered the knife and pushed her away from him. "Catherine, damn you! You dragged me into this madness with kidnapping a child. We only discussed scaring him, not actually doing this madness. Where did you lead me?" Catherine moved back a few steps. Her posture changed. She no longer played the role of the frightened woman. Now there was something of a predator in her, cornered. "How naive you both are." Her voice was full of contempt. "Two spoiled boys fighting over daddy's toys." She suddenly lunged at Michael and snatched the knife. With one fluid motion, she twisted his arm behind his back and put the blade to his throat. "Now it's your turn, Jack," she said coldly. "Drop the gun, or are you ready to lose your brother as easily as you lost me? Come on, make a decision." I hesitated. Reason screamed that it was a bluff, that she wouldn't dare kill Michael. But something in her eyes, something wild, uncontrollable, made me doubt it. "Don't do it," Michael said hoarsely. "She's bluffing." "Are you sure?" Catherine pressed the knife harder. "I've come too far to walk away empty-handed." I slowly lowered the gun. "Let him go, Catherine, okay? You win, take me instead of him, I'll sign whatever you want. And I'll get out of here, only with my child, I don't need anything else." I threw the gun to the ground away from me, a few meters to the side. "A noble act," she smirked. "But the problem is you've both seen my true face, and I don't leave witnesses." Catherine immediately released Michael and rushed to the weapon. In her haste, she didn't notice that the edge of the path had crumbled under the rain. Her foot fell into the quicksand, she lost her balance, and with a scream fell into the swamp. Panic contorted her face. She began to thrash, which only accelerated her sinking. "Shoot, help me," she cried, reaching out her hand. Michael and I stood next to each other, not moving, as if petrified. I picked up the gun but didn't shoot. "Pull me out, you idiots." Catherine's voice became shrill with terror. The quicksand had already reached her waist. "And would you have pulled us out?" I asked quietly. Her face twisted with rage. For the first time since our acquaintance, I saw the real Catherine, without masks, without pretense. "I used you both," she shouted as the quicksand reached her chest. "You men are all the same. You think with what you have in your pants. It's so easy to manipulate you." Michael made a move as if to help, but I held him by the shoulder. "You never loved even me." There was childish offense in his voice. Catherine laughed hysterically, choking on the foul sludge, the swamp already reaching her neck. "Loved, not for a second. Not you, not your brother. not this damn town. The only thing I loved was the money I was going to take from you." Her gaze shifted to me. "And your son was the biggest hindrance. Too smart, too observant, always looked at me as if he saw right through me." Her words turned into a gurgle as the quicksand covered her chin. "I hate you, I hate." It was the last thing we heard before the swamp swallowed her completely. Bubbles on the surface, the only evidence that there had just been a woman there. We stood in silence, broken only by the chirping of insects. Michael pressed his hand to the cut on his neck. In his eyes I read shock and something else, maybe relief. Suddenly voices and the cracking of branches came from the forest. Sheriff Bobby with a group of rangers and dogs came into the clearing. Next to him, Tommy, frightened but unharmed. "Dad!" The boy broke free from the ranger's arms and ran to me. "Tommy," I hugged him, not believing my eyes. "How did you?" "The dogs found his trail," Bobby explained, coming closer. "He was so well hidden that we never would have noticed if it wasn't for them." The sheriff surveyed the scene, nodding our tense faces in Catherine's absence. "What happened here?" he asked, looking from me to Michael and back. We exchanged a long look. "An accident," I finally replied. "Catherine, she fell into the swamp. We couldn't save her." Bobby looked at the surface of the quicksand, where there were already no traces left, then back at us. In his eyes I read understanding. "I see," he nodded. "A dangerous place it always has been." Epilogue. Months pass. Michael is sitting in the county jail, not for the murder of Catherine, but for complicity in Tommy's kidnapping. He was given a small sentence, only 2 years, largely thanks to my testimony about how at the last moment he tried to stop all this madness. I sit across from him in the visiting room, separated by a table but not by glass, as for particularly dangerous criminals. Michael has lost weight, become gaunt, but in his eyes there is clarity that I haven't seen since childhood. "I am reforming the sawmill," I say. "Introducing environmental standards, paying compensation to those who have suffered. In the spring, we'll start a reforestation program." "Sounds expensive," he smiles wryly. "It's right," I look him in the eye. "That's what Dad would have wanted deep down." Michael is silent, then slowly nods. "You know, he was proud of you," he says unexpectedly. "He never admitted it, but I saw him cutting articles about your awards out of the newspapers. He kept them in the top drawer of his desk." I feel something clench in my chest. "I'll save a place for you, brother," I say, changing the subject. "When you get out, we'll work together like Dad wanted. We'll make the company what it should be." A single tear rolls down Michael's cheek, the first one I've seen in many years. I reach out across the table and squeeze his hand. "We'll get through this, brother," I say, "together." Leaving the prison, I see Tommy waiting for me at the gate. He has changed over these months, become taller, more confident, stopped flinching at every sharp sound. We walk to the car and I ask, "Don't you want to go back to Boston? Your friends' school are there." Tommy shakes his head. "No, Dad, our place is here, where all the stones are." And for the first time since his mother died, he smiles sincerely, biting his lower lip just like Mary used to do. At that moment, I realize that we are finally home. If you enjoyed this story, please support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thank you.